It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood, a beautiful day for a neighbor. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? That iconic theme song from Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood is like chicken soup to me on a cold, chilly day. I can remember growing up in my living room, laying flat on my stomach in that sea of shag carpeting, watching our television. Well, watching it after I had adjusted my tinfoil wrapped antenna on top of the TV to give me a slightly less staticky and wavy reception. Good times. I can remember every single time Mr. Rogers would start singing to me, and he'd walk through the door. He'd slip into that red sweater he always wore, slip on his sneakers, and then look right at the screen and say, "Hello, neighbor." For 28 minutes, I was transported from my living room into a land where I was safe, a place of friends and puppets, a place where we could be honest about the emotions that were stirring within us. As an ordained Presbyterian pastor, Fred Rogers, he embodied empathy and compassion and care. And my hunch is that if Mr. Rogers was still on the air today, he would be looking at all of us and saying, "How are you doing? How are you doing facing this uncertain time with the coronavirus? Do you feel some dis-ease stirring within you, some anxiety that's hovering in the air?" I'm certain that he would remind all of us to keep washing our hands while singing our ABCs. He'd probably tell us that the average American touches his or her face 23 times every hour. Make that 24 because you probably all did that at home right now. So how are you doing? How are you doing with all this uncertainty that's swirling around us and is certainly swirling within each of us? Have you been wondering what you can do to try to take care of yourself, and what you can do to take care of others who you care about, and how you can respond in such a time as this? Are you maybe reconsidering whether or not you should take a trip that's coming up? Are you paying attention to maybe who touched the grocery cart before you did, or the person seated close to you who's coughing? I know for me, I'm constantly wondering how. How is it that the phrase, "Well, it can't get any worse than this," keeps getting proved wrong day after day after day? It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood. Maybe those words just seem as distant and disconnected as the planet Pluto does from Earth right now. Make no mistake about it. Being a neighbor, that was what was at the heart of what Jesus and the lawyer were talking about in the parable that I just read to you. Now, prior to the passage where we picked it up, Jesus and the lawyer had been discussing for quite a time, and Jesus had asked the lawyer about some of the laws. And the lawyer proved that he knew those 600 plus laws of the Torah. He knew them backwards and forwards. He knew them right side up and upside down. He'd gotten the gold star of Bible memorization on his Sabbath school attendance form. He knew the law. He had answered Jesus' questions correctly. And then the lawyer goes and asks Jesus a question. He turns the tables upside down. As if he's sort of saying, "Well, okay, Mr. Fancy Pants Street Preacher, riddle me this. Who is my neighbor?" Now, to be sure, the lawyer and Jesus, any person steeped in the Jewish tradition of those 600 laws, knew a response to who was my neighbor. The neighbor was anyone who was lost, who was lonely, who was feeling left out in those days. Our neighbors are our brothers and sisters in China who've been dealing with the coronavirus for weeks. Our friends in Italy, people in Seattle, and right here in Sarasota who are afflicted with corona or afraid of what might happen in the world right now. The law was clear. Those 600 laws are clear on who your neighbor is. It's the widow, it's the orphan, it's the person who's afraid, who's uncertain, those who are on self-quarantine right now and maybe need some groceries brought to them. The law was clear. Who is my neighbor? It's anyone. It's everyone whose pathways ours intersects with. Underneath all of those laws, and what comes to the fore in the passage, is this sense of compassion. That word compassion, it means to suffer with, to abide with, to be present with. But you see, Jesus doesn't just jump to the answer. He doesn't just give a solution to the question. Instead, Jesus does something else. He tells a story. I wonder how different would our world be today if instead of always offering our opinions, we shared our stories instead. Jesus tells a story today. He tells a story about a man who went from Jerusalem down to Jericho. It was a journey that many Jewish people knew well, a path that countless people in the crowd that day might have already traveled. It's a distinctive journey, though. It's a distinctive journey from Jerusalem to Jericho. It's about 18 miles. It would take about 4 hours to walk. But what's so distinctive about it is you go from 2,800 feet above sea level in Jerusalem all the way down to 800 feet below sea level in Jericho. That is a drop and descent worthy of any roller coaster you've ever been on. It's a twisty, turny, rocky, rough pathway. And it's also a pathway that's known to have been filled with thieves. See, the fact that Jesus set up for the story is that a man on that pathway is beaten and robbed. That wouldn't have struck anyone as unusual. It was a dangerous pathway that people knew about. The fact that someone would have been beaten and robbed, that wouldn't have even made the nightly news. People just called that Monday. But what Jesus does do is, after a setup that was very familiar to people, he starts to turn up the tension in the story. He turns up the tension first and foremost by having the first character on the scene after the person's hurting be a priest. A priest who doesn't just only look the other way. The priest literally goes to the edge of the road to pass by. Likewise, a Levite does the exact same thing. The tension starts to get turned up in the passage. And Jesus cranks it even more as it's a Samaritan. A Samaritan who stops to tend to the one who's hurting, harmed, wounded there on the side of the road. Say that Jewish people and Samaritans had some tension, didn't get along. That's sort of like saying that Ohio State and Michigan have a bit of a football rivalry, or that North Carolina and Duke basketball don't like each other, or Or maybe that Republicans and Democrats have a bit of a disagreement. You see, perhaps, friends, polarization isn't quite as new a phenomenon as we sometimes think. So if the tension was increased having a Samaritan stopped, Jesus doesn't even stop there. He continues to sort of stir the pot by having the Samaritan pick the wounded man up, put him on his own animal, take him to an inn, and promise to pay the innkeeper whatever health care costs are needed for this man to be made well. If you bring this passage of Scripture close to your heart, I think you can still feel the fumes of frustration, of offense from our ancestors centuries ago. I don't know if Jesus was trying to stir the pot when he told that story, but I am certain that he was not going to be nominated for Rabbi of the Year telling parables like that. And what I'm also certain on is if there was ever a time when we needed to not just ponder intellectually like it's a good idea the parable of the Good Samaritan, if there was ever a time when we needed to bring this parable so close to our hearts, if ever there was a time that you and I need to embody being the Good Samaritan, it is right here and right now in these days. I wish, I pray with the deepest part of my heart that I had a cure for the coronavirus. I wish I could help dissipate that anxiety that just keeps hovering and hanging in the air and sitting with inside me. But I'm also well aware that we didn't get to this place overnight. And I'm not just talking about our illnesses. Rob Bell said it well this week. He said that we have been duct taping over the cracks. We've been trying to wallpaper over our brokenness. And if ever the dis-ease within us got a little too unbearable, well, then just binge watch something else on Netflix to distract yourself. For far too long, that anxiety, that fear has been hovering around us and within us. And the response of the church in times of anxiety, in times of uncertainty, in times when we're not just clear, the response of the church has always been not to retract, but to reach toward. The response and reaction of the church has always been to try to embody the Good Samaritan for each other. And so I want to encourage you this day, this week, to let that compassion, that call to suffer with, that sense you feel deep within you to reach out, to exercise that. I invite you, who do you usually sit close to at church? Call that person up on the phone. Is there someone you've been holding in your heart over the last few days? Call that person. Send them an email. If you're going to venture out to the store, call someone else to see if you might pick up a few things for someone who's self-quarantined, who's afraid right now. Reach out. If ever there was a time for the church to be the church and for Good Samaritans to be found far and wide, it is right now. And I promise you, as your pastor, I will continue to do what I can to host Facebook Live prayer moments or to find ways that we can connect as a community, not just in the coming weeks, but this week right here and now. Call me. Reach out to me. If you need a prayer, if you want to connect in some ways, let me know. And I will do everything I can and continue to offer what's deep in my heart. What's deep in my heart today is that you and I would sense that abiding presence of God in life-giving ways, that it would fill us, that the compassion and care that's deep within us, that it wouldn't just end or become a cul-de-sac, that we would become conduits of compassion toward each other. The hymn that's been roaming around my heart over the last few days, the theme song, I think, in these days is that hymn, Abide With Me. It was written by Henry Francis Lyte. Henry Francis was not a particularly well person. He was often ill throughout his whole life. It's said that he wrote that hymn after he had visited a friend who was about to die. He might have reworked and revised the words countless times. But as you listen to Greg play Abide With Me on the organ, I want you to consider what those words say to us. It's said that Henry Francis Lyte, even as his health continued to decline, he couldn't help. He just kept on preaching. He was a man after my own heart. But it's my prayer that in these days we would sense the abiding presence of God, that we would sense God's unconditional and unceasing love, that we would be conduits of God's compassion and care for each other, letting our own Good Samaritan loose into the world, that we might go, you and I, we would go and do likewise in these days.